Hello and welcome to the Vedic Conversation, where each episode we take a different topic and look at it through the lens of storytelling and from the perspective of the Veda, an ancient but very much still relevant body of knowledge from India. I'm Rory Kinsella, a Vedic meditation teacher based in Sydney, and I'm joined by my Vedic colleagues Thompson in London and Derrick Yanford in New York. And this week we're talking about suffering and looking at how when we change our perspective on suffering, we're able to let much of it drop away and instead experience what's happening in the moment, which is often far less bad than our speculating mind would tell us. So sit back and listen to our stories and conversation, and don't forget to stick around until the end, where we'll offer a practical exercise in how you can apply this knowledge to your daily life. And don't forget to give us a rating and review. Okay, so suffering. So last season, when we did the episode on attachment, I talked about the second marathon that I ran where, you may remember, where it all fell apart and I got injured halfway through, but managed to power on through to the end because I changed my personal narrative from about getting my personal best to about overcoming adversity and injury to get over the line. So today, as we're talking about suffering, I'm going to talk about my first marathon. And I realized as I was preparing this that I'm probably not inspiring many people to take up running a marathon with my injuries and this one being suffering. But I really do encourage people to do it. It's what I love about running is it really pushes you to extremes of endurance and physical experience and can teach you lessons in a lot clearer way than normal experience because it's kind of this heightened experience. So it was 2013 when I ran this marathon, and it was only a year after I'd started running where I couldn't run for literally more than 5 minutes. But I'd put in the work and I'd run about 700 kilometers that year. So I was in pretty good shape. But the immediate preparation for the race wasn't ideal because I spent a week partying at Burning Man 2 weeks before. So yeah, and fell off my bike right on the last day of Burning Man, so I was also injured. But my main issue was on the day itself when I decided that I would preemptively protect myself against this small blister I had on the side of my the ball of my right foot by putting one of these blister patches on it, and the idea was that I would protect it. But after about 5 kilometers into the race, I realized what a huge mistake I'd made, because rather than protecting this blister, this patch had caused what it felt like it was causing a much bigger blood blister. And but with only 5 kilometers down and there were 37 more kilometers to go, I knew I wouldn't be able to last the distance if I dwelt on this too much. And it was at this point that I remembered a quote I read in a book about running by the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. And this quote's been attributed to lots of different people, and it's unsure where it came from. But the quote is, "Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional." And this idea made such a big difference to me because before I came across this quote, I guess I thought that pain and suffering were pretty much synonymous, but they're really not. And for me during the race, I was able to separate the physical aspect of pain from the more psychological or emotional aspect of suffering. And if I looked at the pain element, I could assess it on its own. And yeah, it hurt because there was this stinging feeling in my foot literally every time I landed. But it was a kind of reasonably stable pain. It wasn't increasing and it wasn't becoming overwhelming. And knowing that suffering was optional, I was able to drop all my other thoughts. So my suffering thoughts would be along the lines of, I can't believe I've got to run like this for another 3 hours. Why me? I can't believe I've trained so much to be undone by this stupid mistake. But whenever I found myself dwelling on these suffering kinds of thoughts, I could bring myself back. And it's like in meditation, when we find ourselves lost in thought, we bring ourselves back to the mantra. But obviously, we don't use the mantra during eyes open, day-to-day life. So instead, I would bring myself back to my senses. So I would feel the sensations in my body and listen to the shouts from the crowd, and look at my fellow competitors to kind of be inspired by their heroic efforts. And in fact, whenever I'm flagging in a race, one of my favorite things to do is, there's always kids on the side of the course, and I love to go up and high five them because they're always putting their hands out. And they smile and you smile and everything's great. So I got through the race and managed to get almost the time I was aiming for. But then it came the time to take my shoe off. It wasn't pretty. And I went to the St. John's ambulance over there, and the woman actually said it was the biggest blood blister she'd ever seen. And this is a professional medic. But yeah, so I knew if I dwelt on the suffering part of it, I wouldn't have been able to finish. I would have used it as an excuse. But when I separated it out and just had the pain on its own, it was much more manageable. And then I was thinking about how outside of running, after I learned to meditate, I found I suffered a lot less in general, whether it was not suffering through, speculating about things that might or might not happen in the future, or suffering by feeling guilty about things I'd said or done. And then I was thinking about how much of the amount of suffering in my life has been self-inflicted, specifically with hangovers. We've talked about this before, but if you ask someone who has a hangover, how are you doing? They might say, I'm really suffering. And it's that kind of, that aspect of it. And for me, hangovers often weren't about physical stuff. Like, I'm rarely sick on a hangover, like physically sick, but it would be this mental and emotional suffering. So kind of to sum up, like in very general terms, what meditation has done for suffering is that similar aspect to how it did in the running, where it takes you out of this suffering, which is a mental process, and brings you back to reality. And reality in the present moment, there's hardly ever anything wrong right now. It's only when you project it. So projecting, what could happen if I look in my shoe, or what could, these possibilities, it's not actually what's happening now.
Awesome.
Wow. And you weren't put off from running further marathons?
No, but after number 2, I haven't done another one yet. I'm thinking about it for next year.
Okay. But you're staying away from the blister packs?
Yeah, I would definitely not recommend using one of those. I could just feel it. It created this perfect bubble that then my foot tried to get it, like, become the shape of that plaster. I showed so many people the photo afterwards, and they were not thankful for that.
But it's interesting. What I think, there are so many sporting stories where it's mind over matter. That old sort of expression where you're in an extreme situation and you had a choice either to stop or to keep going. And if you're going to keep going, then you had to apply certain psychological and mental approaches to the situation to get over that. And I'm reminded of a motor racing story. I think it was Juan Fangio, who was the world considered to be one of the world's greatest motor racing drivers. I think it was in the 1956 Argentine Grand Prix, where it was so hot you could actually fry an egg on the bonnet of the car before it had even started the engine. Wow. And the heat was immense. And these were open cockpit cars, and the heat of the engine, your feet are astride the drive shaft, so there's a lot of heat coming from sort of between your legs. you're in an enclosed space there, you've got the heat coming down from the sun, and it was torture for a lot of people. And he won the race by quite a handsome margin. And when people said afterwards, how did you deal with the heat? He said, I imagined that I was sitting inside an ice bath, that actually it wasn't heat, it was extreme cold. And it's just such a fascinating, analogy or idea that you just flip it. You just literally think the opposite thing. And I've just recently started taking cold showers.
In the winter.
Takes me back to my school days. But, hot shower, and then you just incrementally just keep turning the cold. And the way I'm getting around it is thinking, okay, I'm on a hot, Caribbean island. It is insufferably hot. And I'm really looking forward to this cold shower. And it sort of works. I mean, I know it's crazy and it sounds bizarre, but I do that on a daily basis now. There's this kind of exercise of mind over matter that, the water, out of choice, you really wouldn't want to do that. But you feel fantastic afterwards. You feel, your whole body. So, that's a tough story, Rory. I mean, you must have been in quite a bit of pain afterwards.
This is why marathons are such good life experiences and they're such challenges, because there's always something that comes up, and you're kind of creating this artificial life challenge, which is going to be hard to overcome, and then you'll learn lessons from it. Like almost everyone would learn some lessons. So I think it's really good challenge for that. But what you're saying about the shower and the racing driver, you can do that. You can create a kind of opposite meaning, or you can just take out the judgment from whatever you're feeling. Like for me, it was like, here's this stinging in my foot, but it's not that bad. It's just like a signal that something might be wrong. But I can say, that's bad, or I can just say that's neutral. So it's, we can put those interpretations on that physical sensation. And another kind of classic example is butterflies in your stomach. So people can either say, oh, that's excitement, or that's anxiety. That's a classic one where depending on your view of that feeling, and it's the same feeling, it's the same physical sensation, it's just your interpretation of it might be different. So having the power to step back from, I think this is what we get from meditation, is we can snap ourselves out of that I'm having a bad experience and go, well, hang on, how could I view this differently now? Because we're used to breaking our thought patterns with, oh, I'm coming back to the mantra. That's that great way of snapping out. So if we're able to stop ourselves in the moment and go, hang on, I'm not having a good resourceful response to this, how can I change it? Then we're in a lot better position to succeed. Like your guy winning the race in his ice bath, boiling hot motor car.
It's that adaptability, isn't it? It's that change of perspective. I mean, so often I'm just thinking of various episodes in my life when people have said to me, well, this is going to be tough, or this is going to hurt. Maybe if you're going to the dentist, they're going to say, would you like an anesthetic? The implication is this is going to hurt like hell, so you better take it. And so they've already started to condition you as to how you're going to feel. And as you say, as Vedic meditators, we have the ability to just kind of block that, stand back, take perspective, and say, am I going to buy into that, or am I going to resist it? In a sense, there is a degree of speculation that you're kind of being told what the story is going to be, and you then start speculating about, well, is that really going to be like that, or do I have a choice? And there is a choice, as you say.
And I think there is also this idea, because the dentist's another key one for me, which I've got a lot better at since becoming a meditator, as we've talked about before. And it's that idea of, if I can say, is it okay now? Then the answer is always yes. And if it isn't, you say stop. But what I didn't like before was because I was imagining the next step, like the whiz of the drill, and thinking, right, that could lead to immense pain. And like with my foot, it's like it was okay at all points, but it could have got worse. And it's that allowing your imagination to take hold and increase it to something unbearable. Like with the motor drivers, they all, I presume, most of them finished. Like it wasn't physically unbearable. It's that thought of I can't do this, which is you're creating that reality of not being able to do it. Like the dentist is creating that thing of there will be pain, which are all how we mentally set ourselves up for these things.
Yeah, it's this, as we mentioned before, it's the sort of story we tell ourselves. You know? We're kind of writing the script as to how it's going to be.
So my question is, what prompted you wanting to run a marathon? Because I know from my childhood, running, I don't enjoy it at all. It's very difficult for me. Like, you know what I mean? The way that I breathe, what my mind is doing. So I'm just curious. And it sounds like, you know, you weren't necessarily into running. You couldn't do it for a prolonged period of time. What made you think, oh, running a marathon is something I should do?
Yeah, well, I guess it's because I'm a bit of an all or nothing kind of person. And during my I've talked about this before, but my midlife crisis, when I realized I was 35, I didn't want to be a party monster anymore and started changing my life. Fitness was one of the first things I changed because, you know, it's, especially in Australia, lots of people go out running all the time. It's a common thing to do. And I knew that I was physically unfit. So I wanted a way to get fit. And that was the way. And what I found was that after the not being able to run for more than 5 minutes and getting a bit better, I found that I felt good. And it was this idea that physical exercise changes your kind of hormonal, chemical, internal makeup, and I could have access to this internal pharmacy of endorphins and serotonin, and I would feel good. You know, there's the classic runner's high, and I got a taste of the runner's high when I'd done a half marathon, and it was like, whoa, you know, this is a kind of a special feeling and a different feeling, and it's something that you can get without having to, you know, drink or take drugs or anything. It's something that your body has access to these things, but they don't come by sitting watching the TV. They come from putting yourself through this physical exercise. So being a bit of an extremist, I went from 0 to marathon quite quickly. And I think it's also because I have this, if you do one of the personality type things called the Enneagram, there are 9 personality types, and I come out as the achiever. And the achiever sounds quite good, but the achiever is a little bit hollow inside and needs that external kind of confidence boost of achievement in the outside world. So they like good marks and they like to perform well at work. So I my achieverness applied itself to running.
When was the last time you did a marathon?
I think it was 2015 or 16. So it's time for another one.
Well, I wonder, Rory, you see, I have this, I feel quite strongly about running. I used to run a bit, quite a few years ago. And then I realized that running, as you say, gets you into a completely different physical and mental and chemical state, which, when you think about it, is the complete opposite of where we are when we're meditating. We are putting ourselves in the artificial fight-flight state. We're putting ourselves in that state artificially. And when we're meditating, we are resting at a very profound level. And I found that as I was getting into my meditation, the charm of going for a run diminished because I was putting myself into an extreme opposite from where I actually seemed to benefit most and where I enjoyed most of my time.
Yeah, I do take that point, but I think it is also very important for us to have some way of physically moving ourselves, and possibly more so. Like the yoga that I like is yin, which isn't exercise. So I think like it's I notice the difference if I don't do proper aerobic exercise. Like I will feel unaccountably, somber or down, and I'll be like, that was so clear to me because I, ran the experiment quite a few times that I would schedule it in and I would have to do it, even if I didn't feel like it, because I knew that for the days after I would feel better. And, doctors would tell you this, that I think we definitely need that physical exercise component to go with our
Absolutely
de-excitation, but it's, swimming's probably a more Vedic, although, Indians aren't very good at swimming. But
you're an Australian, you live by the sea, you should be excellent, especially when you're swimming away from those sharks.
Surfing's a very good Vedic analogy, but I don't know, I picked running, and you need to find something that you like, and if it appeals to you and it's charming to you, then go for it. If it becomes less charming for you, go for something else. But I always recommend to my students that they should have, as any doctor would, physical exercise, because it makes a big difference. It makes everything so much easier in that getting those feel-good chemicals going.
Yeah, I think for mental health, it's been shown, to be fantastically effective, really, really helpful.
Yeah, and if we're gonna, piggyback off of the last episode that we had with Tim about what are we doing here as human beings on the planet, is experience. And so we have this wide range of experience available to us, whether it is on the transcendent passive end or the extreme physical end. And what is it like to have all of those experiences in between? And so as we're talking, I'm actually now curious about, what would it be like, or what would I have to do to experience that runner's high? Because I would imagine there is pleasure in that, like you've talked about. And there was a time when I would kind of force myself to run. I would go in between walking and running because I too thought it would be good for me, especially because I was like, I had an adversity to it. And I did find times where I was like, I was proud of myself for running because I didn't want to. But I am curious, like, I don't know that I'm ready for any half marathon kind of situation, but what would it be like to run a mile? Just hey, you know what? 1 mile you're going to run and have that experience, because I haven't had it in a while.
Well, you can report back next week.
Okay.
That's good. We do the Vedic Conversation challenge.
I think it'll turn into the Vedic runners conversation. You soon get me going, getting back to it.
We can all do a cold shower as well.
And speaking of cold showers, Anthony, I'd love to hear your suffering.
Suffering. Well, apart from my daily little 10-minute dose of suffering, I'm happy to share my little story here.
Just as a little interlude before you start, when I was preparing this, I put in my calendar, I blocked out an hour for suffering. My girlfriend saw it and she's like, "Oh, sorry to interrupt your suffering, but it's time for lunch."
Masochist. And he spends 20 minutes a day meditating, but then, oh wow, suffering.
Perfect.
Oh, I like that. Well, when I was in my early teens, I was fortunate to spend summer holidays in the Mediterranean, and it was good fun for all sorts of reasons, but not least because I was joined up with a group of teenagers who came from all over Europe, and they would come every year, and we used to have a lot of fun. And one summer, an English family arrived, and I was introduced to Mark, who was around the same age as me. And with his 2 sisters and 3 brothers, he'd be in the thick of it, water skiing, larking around on the beach, and going to nightclubs like the rest of us. But Mark was different. He was blind, and he only had one arm as a result of an accident which he had when he was a young boy. And my immediate reaction when I heard his story was to be sympathetic, but his attitude to life left little room for that sentiment. his family made very few concessions to his physical disabilities, and he was encouraged to lead a normal life, which he was determined to do, as was evident when there was some dancing going on. So whenever we arrived at a nightclub, and we used to spend most nights trying to get into, or actually managing to arrive inside a nightclub, although we were probably underage. When we got into the nightclub, he would always ask me if the dance floor was crowded, which it usually was. And then he would reach into a bag and pull out a large stainless steel hook, which he had attached to his arm. And I would then lead him onto the dance floor, and he would start going through some really wild and expansive moves while, shaking and waving this hook around. And of course, it wouldn't surprise you to know that there was always then plenty of room to dance. There's no doubt that he suffered greatly when the accident occurred. But when I met him, he had put it behind him. He was not going to be labeled a victim. He was going to be the fun-loving guy, making the best of every occasion, even when water skiing, and his brothers tried to shake him off. It was an unbelievable sight. Unlike many people who've suffered an accident, he didn't blame himself or anyone else for what happened. Although he wasn't a meditator, he was displaying aspects of the kind of Vedic perspective on suffering. His understanding and perspective reduced his suffering. As meditators, our technique and broad consciousness, together with understanding and perspective, minimizes suffering. And Mark wasn't going to hide behind suffering or use it as a reason for not participating at the fullest level. He could so easily have won the suffering competition, but he simply didn't care or want to join in. As a child, I too had a bad accident on holiday and nearly lost my left hand. For many years, I'd returned to the same place for family holidays and would frequently walk past the wall against which the boat nearly crushed my hand. I didn't do this deliberately to face down the fear or to avoid that location because of some strong memories. 4 years after that accident, I learned to meditate, and I've no doubt that the scars, the mental scars of that experience, were eventually erased, and all the stressful chemical reactions associated with that memory were washed away. So to me today, it's sort of just happened and that's it. I don't have any associated emotions with it. Our understanding of stress is that what was happening at the time, all the things going on at that moment, in my case, it was the sound of the sea, the seagulls overhead, the approaching boat. It's not stored consciously or subconsciously. It's stored subliminally in the cells of the body and becomes a stress trigger, what neuroscientists call a precognitive commitment. And I've realized that just after a few years of meditation, our baseline chemistry changes and we eliminate all the flight-fight chemistry because we're resting very deeply during our meditation practice, and we can become more adaptive and meet the demands with capability. And our empathy increases with the ability to experience within what somebody else is experiencing. We're experiencing others as an extension of ourself, and the world starts to change. We realize that whilst the world is full of need, we are a field of total capability, that we're not full of neediness anymore. In fact, we now look for where there is neediness and how we can deal with it using our expanded creativity and adaptation energy. And there may be moments of sadness or feelings of suffering, but we recover rapidly and move on because feeling angry or sad or fearful and staying like that isn't really relevant to the needs of the time.
Beautiful. It's so interesting the way that you talk about your friend Mark, who maybe initially we would make some assumption about the degree to which they're suffering, right? This perceived suffering. And then to have an exchange with him and be doing all these wonderful, amazing things that he and his life and his experience can actually inspire you to maybe enjoy yours even more. That it for me, it goes, yeah, okay, what actually is suffering? And how do you know if somebody is doing it? And I feel like we often apply our own idea of what suffering is onto everybody else and go, oh, yeah, if I didn't have an arm or if I couldn't see, I would feel such and such a way. Perhaps, or more likely, they are feeling that way. And so we have this whole idea about what the suffering of another human being is. And then you have an experience that goes, oh my God, that's it's not suffering at all, and you know, I love these kinds of stories because it always reminds me of when I am experiencing suffering too, that it's like, oh, is that because I think this is what suffering's supposed to be like? And even just having that thought, I can go, okay, you can choose to the degree of how much you want to suffer. You know what I mean? So I love that you shared those stories. Really puts it into perspective.
Yeah, and Derek, that idea you just kind of said, which I think often gets brought up as an issue for people with disabilities is not the actual disability, it's people's perception of them. And as you talked about your friend Mark, like he wasn't having any troubles, but there would be what people would think about them, and then you have to deal with that judgment. And my girlfriend Susie was listening to a talk at work recently by this guy Dylan Alcott, who's an Olympian, Australian, disabled, like Paralympian tennis player. Like he's the best tennis player ever. And he was telling them that he's perfectly good at many things, but he'll get reactions like people will see him in a cafe and go, "Oh, it's so good that you can come to this cafe," and he's like, "Look, I've won multiple Olympic gold medals. What have you done? Congratulations to you for making it to this cafe." But also this idea that I've read about before, where I can't remember how these studies work, but they'll test people's happiness levels, by asking them how happy they are in this study, and then people will either get a terminal illness or get disability during the study, and they'll test their happiness levels after. And they found that after that kind of shock period where you have to readjust to your new conditions, people's happiness level quickly returns to what it was before. So if you were a happy person before and then you have an accident, you will get back to that same happiness level again. And I think it's just that readjustment period, and maybe linking into what we talked about before in our acceptance episode, where maybe suffering is more that resistance to what's happening, as well as the speculating about what that could mean, rather than thinking, well, let me run the experiment of what it actually does mean right now, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rory.
I'm curious, do you have any contact with Mark at all? Do you know what he's doing?
I've lost contact with him because he was kind of a holiday friend. But I heard some stories a bit later, and he was still living life to the full. Because he didn't know any different. I mean, that's just how you lived your life. He couldn't see how other people were behaving. I mean, he could probably hear and sense, but that wasn't going to condition the way he was there to have a really good time and be in the moment. And boy, he could party hard. Yeah, he was quite a player.
Did he ever hook anyone with his hook on the dance floor?
Not that I ever saw. He also had he could take the hook off, and he had a sort of pincer contraption in where he could hold a glass and things like that. He was pretty adept at using it, but most of the time he didn't have it on. I mean, water skiing with one hand, unbelievable. On two skis, absolutely unbelievable guy. But it's interesting what you're, Rory, talking about the happiness quota. I understand that, with meditation, that we, as meditators, we experience a wider range of emotions, and perhaps we feel sadness and some of the negative emotions more strongly than non-meditators, but we don't hang out in that area for very long. And in the positive range of emotions, we feel them strongly too, but we hang out for longer. And the reverse is true of non-meditators. So non-meditators might get happy, but they don't stay there for very long and they come straight out of it. Whereas meditators will stay happy for quite a while. And when I'm with a group of meditators, whether it's on retreats or my students or hanging out with colleagues, you guys, generally speaking, people, the sort of happiness level, the engagement level is very high. People don't want to dwell on the negative. They're always looking for the positive. What they put their attention on grows. Don't dwell on the gloomy stuff. Doesn't serve any purpose, and it's irrelevant. It's not pertinent. It serves no need to what is necessary now. Right now, yes, there's appalling suffering all over the world, but we have the choice. We are fortunate. We have the choice as to whether to dwell and sort of bathe in the sorrowness, in the suffering. But we have a choice to move out of it, and if we can, we should. Doesn't serve any purpose just hanging about in that. It's an indulgence, and for a lot of people it is an indulgence, and for all sorts of reasons, psychosomatic or hypochondria or perhaps mental issues. There was a very interesting report that got published this week about statins, which most people take to lower their cholesterol. And statins have a well-known basket of fairly unpleasant side effects. And what they discovered is that through controlled experiments and blind testing and so on and so forth, is that the actual components of the pill don't cause the side effects. It's the mental approach. It's because people have been told that there are some bad side effects that they get them. So this was what they called the nocebo, not the placebo, but the nocebo. So they gave people sugar pills and said, these are statins, and they developed all these side effects. Fascinating. Really, really interesting. So they in a sense surrendered to the idea that they would suffer, because somebody in a white coat, somebody in authority said, or maybe they did. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the researchers didn't say that, but they would have done their own research. But in that sort of environment, you think, oh, okay, this is going to hurt.
Very interesting, that negative placebo effect. Just shows again how powerful the mind is.
Yeah. Derrick, how's your suffering? I hope you haven't suffered.
Tell us about it.
I will. And it's interesting because this topic was a bit tricky in terms of recalling a story from my past where I was suffering, as my idea about suffering and the extent to which I suffer and its purpose have largely been overhauled since I started meditating about 10 years ago. I was able to recount a time in which I was causing my own suffering, and that I was convinced about how I would be perceived by my audience. So when I was growing up as a dancer, I had many idols. And one in particular was a gentleman by the name of Tice Diorio. And he was from a small studio in Brooklyn called Horizons, under the direction of a great teacher. And Tice has had an amazing professional career, having danced with Janet Jackson, Paula Abdul, and he is the choreographer for Taylor Swift. But as an amateur, he grew up in the competition dance world, much like I did. And he had achieved a national title from the oldest dance organization in the US called Dance Masters of America. But my earliest memory of seeing him dance was on television in the 1980s on Star Search, hosted by Ed McMahon. And, Tice has an incredible facility, captivating stage presence, coupled with strength and power. And in a word, he was amazing. And I've always been in awe of his performance. The mistake I made was comparing myself to him and thinking that no one would ever clap for me the way that they did for him. And I was convinced that I would never be as good, and began to question what adults had told me about being whatever you want to be, that anything was possible if you set your mind to it. I started to think this was all a lie, just something people said to motivate you. This all began to spiral into suffering that I was causing myself. And I wasn't in any pain or discomfort from my environment or my body. My mind was the creator of this imaginary world that I felt doomed to exist in, being less than. And, I was just jealous and envious of not having the same skill or recognition. As I grew into my own artistry, I began to discard the idea or need to be perceived as anything in particular, and came to understand that I have no control over what people think or feel about me or my skill. And what became important was that I was cultivating my passion and being the best dancer I could be. I soon began to realize that comparison is the killer of joy, and that my job was to get out on stage and share my love of dance with those who were watching. And comparing myself to others is a setup to suffering, when the reality is I cannot be anyone but me. And better yet, no one else can be me. And that's enough. And, recalling this story is so interesting because I remember where I was when I was having that thought, like sitting on this couch and thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to be this person. And it's been a long time since I thought about it. And the interesting thing is about how it's kind of trickled into my career as a teacher, because I still am in or was in the competition dance world where, you're training students who will get on stage and will be judged and given awards and compared to each other. And this can be, for a young artist, if we don't prepare them properly about how it is a tool to help them get better, they can kind of take it the wrong way. And I often tell people the same thing. It's like, look, the real you is way more interesting than the fake somebody else that you're trying to be. And the reality is you can't be anybody else because everybody else has already been taken. But nobody else can be you. And as far as like the comparison thing, I remember my grandmother. I had 4 brothers and sisters. And so when it came to the holidays and we were giving gifts and that, it's a lot for one family to give us. I remember this one year, my grandmother had given us all a box of pencils, I think with our names on it. And I think we all opened them at the same time. And we took the lid off and we were all so like, and then we looked to see what everybody else got. And my grandmother was like, really? You need to look. You can't be happy with what you're given. You have to, whatever. And it's just like, that it's such an interesting idea. It's like, if you didn't consider what somebody else has, you're just looking at what you have, you might find immense joy and pleasure. And then you play the comparison game. What is it that I have is it better or worse than this person? And now you go, oh, I want this thing, or I don't have this, and this is that. I've just created suffering, unknowingly. And now, and that's the other thing is, I'm sure there's many other times, but I feel like I don't even consider those things as suffering anymore. It's all kind of like, I'm very happy with who I am, and even more so with who I'm becoming, and I still have idols. There's still people that I look up to and would like to emulate, but coming to know, I am who I am, and that's okay. But I don't have to be like anyone else. And just like all the stories we've been talking about, I have a choice when it comes to suffering. And what I enjoy about it, or what the purpose I think suffering has now that I'm aware of, that I wasn't before, was when you are feeling like you're suffering, that is your signal to go, okay, what is it you're missing in the present moment? And especially during this pandemic, I feel like every day I take the position that there are people who are having a much more difficult time than I am. And that has kind of propelled me to, I was walking around my room the other day, just grateful for my feet hitting the ground. I can't explain it to you other than I was like, walking is great, which I don't, or I was driving from Massachusetts to New York yesterday, and just the way the sun was, and the pink in the sky and the clouds, and I was like, I've seen that however many times. I was just like, wow, this is amazing. So I'm not going to say that I don't suffer at all, but it's just it's a thing that reminds me, okay, you don't have to. You can if you want to, and that's the other thing. If I wanted to, I could choose suffering right now, and nothing would have to change in my environment. And like Rory, when you were saying earlier about, pain and suffering, and kind of thinking that those things were synonymous, I'm aware that I could be in a lot of pain and not suffering, and I could be in no pain and be suffering, and that is largely because of my meditation practice. That's really, it's changed the whole idea about what suffering is for me.
That's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story.
So much great
Did
stuff.
you find, just in the preparation of pulling that story together, that you could get a flavor of some of that suffering? Did you kind of taste the suffering of yesteryear?
Great question. So the interesting thing about it is I can see myself in that moment, because it was at my friend Ree, who was on the show. It was at his house, because he was actually a good friend of Tice, and we had maybe been somewhere where Tice had just been at, and I was sitting on his couch, and it dawned on me like a ton of bricks, and I was like, ah! So as I recalled it, it's not nearly as intense. And I just kind of remember what I think I looked like, but the feeling is not as visceral at all.
So it's almost like a sort of dispassionate view now.
Yes. Yeah.
It's kind of just
very distant. Because if I think in that moment, I would imagine that there was a lot of other things that I was suffering about too, that I'm not in that mindset anymore. So I'm aware of it, but in a very, very different way.
You make that great point about people suffering because they're comparing themselves to each other. And, most of Western commerce is based on the idea that he's got it, I haven't, I want it. and the grass is greener. Or we have an expression here which is Porsche in the drive, but nothing in the fridge.
I've not heard that one.
You not heard that one? Yeah,
It was,
it's go on.
sorry, the comparing thing was reminding me of the social dilemma episode recently, because one of the bad parts about social media is you see the best part, the most polished part of someone else's life. Maybe my marathon triumph or something, and I don't post for ages, and then if you're seeing the best part of everyone else's, and then you're thinking, well, hang on, I'm seeing myself today just moping around the house. I haven't got Derrick's nice magic feet, or I'm loving just padding around, and maybe I'm not feeling great. And then I look at social media, and it hasn't happened as much this year, but people post when they're on holiday, having these glamorous times, and you just see everyone else's holiday, and you think, well, I've got this humdrum thing here. And I think that modern technology of social media has made the comparing mind much more, it's kind of heightened it, because rather than just walking around and seeing other people in their normal lives, you're seeing this fake polished presented version of everyone, which if you're not kind of conscious enough to know that that's an artificial thing, then you just think that everyone else is this shiny, amazing being.
I think we need to reassure our listeners and viewers that there is no editing on this program. It's just done in one take. We don't go back. We don't polish. If we screw up, we screw up. It's warts and all, folks. You're seeing us real. There's nothing artificial about this.
Which is interesting, because I don't remember who pointed it out to me, but this idea, so not only posting your holiday pictures and whatnot, but also taking that snapshot and using a filter to create an illusion that it's even more glamorous than it is or whatnot, kind of speaks to what is your feeling about the reality of what's going on? Why is that not good enough? And for me, I had an experience teaching dance that I was very self-conscious of, that I needed to let go. And it was about my appearance. And so I have very sensitive skin, and I have a rash that flares up every now and then on the back of my head. And there was a time when I actually had hair, and I would have a full head of hair, but this one particular area would be red and kind of patchy. And I always had to stand in front of my students. I would be the closest one to the mirror. All my students would be behind me. And there would be times where I'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this is what they're looking at. They're looking at the back of my head. And what do they think? And I finally got to the point where I was like, this is who I am. I wish my body would maybe not have these issues, but I'm going to own it and I'm going to accept it, because I have a lot to offer them, even if I have an unattractive mark on the back of my head. And, I've never used a filter on social media, but when I was in India, one of the people who were in the cafeteria took a picture of us, and there was a filter on it, I guess, that was already set. And so when he showed it to me, I was like, who are these people? I didn't even recognize myself. And I found it interesting, this idea of just letting, like you said, this is unedited, letting the unedited version of yourself be shown to other people, as opposed to, how can I dress it up and create this illusion of something else, And I've really started to enjoy, this is it. This is the authentic me. It's not dazzling and beautiful and eye-catching, and that's okay. But I'm also not thinking, ooh, what are people gonna think about? I don't look really good, or this is out of place. I don't have those kinds of thoughts like I used to. But I don't care.
I think it's very liberating too when you get to that point where you just don't care. I think when you're younger, I see it amongst my kids perhaps, or their contemporaries, people in their perhaps, shall we say, under the age of 35, quite image conscious, image in every sense, their social image, their social media image, how they project themselves, how they come across, and so on and so forth. And I think as you get older, particularly as meditators, we're not interested in the artifice of all of that. We want the authentic experience. Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whoever we're with, we want the authentic experience. And I think we get quite good at, we have a sort of quite finely tuned bullshit detector that, when that's going on, it's, it just doesn't interest us. We'd rather just be doing something else.
Okay, thank you for sticking around until the end. Each episode we offer a takeaway of an exercise you can do at home to start applying this knowledge to your own life. In this episode we were talking about suffering and how when we separate suffering from things like pain and discomfort, we're able to more fully accept our position and make the most of it. So this week we invite you to look at any areas of your life where you might be struggling and see if there are any aspects of suffering that you can let go of. As usual, you can quietly reflect or write your thoughts in a journal or maybe chat with a friend. And if you're happy to share your stories, we'd love for you to join the conversation. Please send them through to us at stories@thevedic.conversation.com or post them on social media with the hashtag #TheVedicConversation and we'll share them in a future episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating and review and share it with your followers. See you again soon.